and welcome to another episode of Three Questions. This is Paul Saunders with the Center for the National Interest. Thank you very much for listening today. I'm really excited to have this conversation, first of all, because I'm a topic I'm really interested in. Secondly, because I have a really great person to talk to about it, who I'll introduce in a minute. And thirdly, because there's shameless self-promotion involved, since we will talk, my guest and I, about a paper that we collaborated on, which is called The Case for Commercial Recycling of Used Nuclear Fuel Assessment and Recommendations. And that's a paper published by an organization called Energy Innovation Reform Project. I'm really pleased to be talking today to Dr. Christina Leggett. Christina has a PhD in nuclear engineering from the University of California, Berkeley. She is currently the director of fuel cycle technology at a company called Oklo that, people who follow nuclear energy probably are familiar with. Others may not be, but it's a company that's developing kind of an exciting new design for I guess we can call it a small modular reactor. And again, to get more technical, and Christina, totally correct me if I'm wrong here, a sodium fast reactor, which is also a small modular reactor. So she's a director of fuel cycle technology at Oklo. She was previously a lead engineer at Booz Allen Hamilton, where she was advising the Department of Energy Advanced Research Projects Agency Energy, ARPA-E, some may know that acronym, and has also been a federal program manager in the Energy Department's Office of Nuclear Energy, and a nuclear engineer and reactor system engineer at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So somebody who has been kind of working on policy and government programs and research and also oversight of nuclear reactors. And also, Christina has been actually on the board of directors of the American Nuclear Society, where she was chair of the Fuel Cycle and Waste Management Division. So that's like a lot of very amazing stuff there, Christina. So congratulations on all of that. But let's kind of jump in here and talk about the paper. There are people out there who listen who are kind of very familiar with nuclear energy and with the idea of recycling used nuclear fuel, which has also in the past been referred to as reprocessing, just for our sort of vocabulary here. Maybe as a departure point, Christina, for those who are not really well versed in nuclear energy and nuclear technology, when we talk about, recycling used nuclear fuel, what does that mean? What are we doing? How does it work? In the paper, we're you and I and another co-author, we're kind of talking about some things that are new, that are kind of new and different emerging approaches to doing this. So could you just talk a little bit about recycling and with an emphasis on, what is it that's new that's really like changing here?
Great questions, Paul. And I want to say thank you first for inviting me on to talk about my absolute favorite topic, which is recycling. And I think this is a great question to start off this podcast. So I'll take your questions one by one, but first, let me just level set for the audience by talking about the nuclear waste situation in the U.S. So today we have about 94 to 96,000 metric tons of commercial use nuclear fuel. Many people refer to it as nuclear waste. But the point is they're safely stored at several nuclear reactor sites around the country. Now, that might seem like a big number, but this actually represents thousands of gigawatts of electricity that have been produced by over 100 commercial nuclear reactors over the last 6 decades. And while I'm at it, I should also point out that the US has the most operating nuclear reactors in the world, 94, which is actually pretty impressive given the fact that there are around 415 reactors operating in the entire world. So we're taking up about 25% of that just in the US. And so, when I talk about nuclear waste, I usually put quotations around it. I know listeners cannot see me doing this, but I always do that. And that's because I don't actually consider used nuclear fuel waste. I seriously don't, because waste is something you don't want anymore, something that you think is useless. In reality, used nuclear fuel still contains significant quantities of usable material, especially actinide elements such as uranium and plutonium that can be reused as nuclear fuel. And then there are also other valuable materials that can be used for other applications like medical isotopes, space, and just other applications like that. So, getting back to your first question, broadly speaking, nuclear fuel recycling separates and reuses actinide materials as new fuel instead of treating it as waste. So, historically, large scale commercial reprocessing or recycling processes that are used around the world today only recover uranium and plutonium as separate products. So there's a uranium stream, there's a plutonium stream, using a tried and true separation process that was developed in the 50s. So, what's different about today's processes compared to the legacy process that's used today? Well, firstly, the processes and technologies that are being commercialized, such as pyroprocessing, recover uranium as well as other actinides together while isolating the other waste, the true waste streams in a controlled engineered system. So what I mean by that is instead of producing, individual uranium and plutonium streams, we have processes that avoid producing pure plutonium that are recovered separately with the uranium. And this improves the proliferation resistance and aligns with existing non-proliferation goals in the US. In addition, several of our technologies used today, we see them as smaller, they're more compact, even modular. They have the capability of being modularized relative to large, complex legacy facilities. So, what that means is that these are ideal for a new deployment paradigm, such as co-location with other nuclear facilities, such as interim storage facilities, right? And so these technologies also generate products in forms that make them suitable for reuse in a variety of advanced reactors, such as sodium fast reactors or molten chloride fast reactors. And, this is what really excites me. It excites me because, we're reusing these actinides in advanced fast reactors in a way that allows you to tap into more of the energy contained in them than existing thermal neutron reactors can. So this is existing, light water nuclear reactors that are operating very safely and reliably in this country. And so what that means is you can get less actinide waste and enhance fuel utilization. And so lastly, I'll say that the biggest shift in today's approach as opposed to historically is that there's more integration. So now we're talking about using recycling as part of a full fuel cycle system, not a standalone solution.
I think that's very helpful, kind of as orientation and just for our listeners here. And this is another case where, correct me if I'm wrong, because you're the nuclear engineer, and I most emphatically am not. But, as we sort of look back at what was done in the past, that was something that was done kind of in part, actually, precisely to produce nuclear weapons, where you sort of wanted to have uranium and plutonium separately because you wanted to take those two materials and use it to make nuclear warheads. Where if you do it in a way that is oriented toward using the material for, commercial nuclear power, and you don't necessarily need to have them separate because of the kind of, reactors that people can make, then it sort of would make it a lot harder for anybody to actually to take that material and use it to make a nuclear weapon. which, to me certainly seems like a great thing. I guess my second question or sort of cluster of questions here, because I can never ask like one, I say three questions, but I can never actually ask one question at a time because I have like too many questions. My second question is this is an activity that really, I think probably everywhere else in the world that it's done or has been done, and that includes, like Russia, France, Japan, I think in the past, but not now. This has been done actually as a government activity, a government program, done by either government agencies or government-owned companies. And the US has taken kind of a really different approach of permitting commercial firms to operate in this space. And that's kind of a reflection of the market-based approach that we take here in the U.S. and the somewhat greater tilt toward that than in some allied countries even that are also market-based democracies. But we've kind of taken very much that approach. And I guess I'm sort of wondering, all these other countries, they're doing this as a government activity. We're talking in the paper about doing it as a commercial activity. Does that mean kind of that there's no role for the government, or what's the role of the government in all of this? Secondly, what is it that you think will permit it to become something that's a commercially viable activity, and not something, again, like in other countries, that's subsidized by taxpayers?
You're just trying to see how the U.S. approach to pursuing recycling, how feasible is it? How can we make it work? And then what's the role of the U.S. government?
Well, I mean, it's unique.
Yeah,
It's one of the rare things in the world that's kind of truly unique. The
it
the
is. It
way
is.
that the
And
United States approaches this.
I agree. It's actually really exciting. Yeah, it's largely more industry driven. And so I guess to answer the question though, the first thing I do want to point out to the audience is that, believe it or not, we as the U.S., we've actually engaged in private sector recycling of used nuclear fuel in the past. This was in the mid 60s to early 70s. It operated for 6 years, and when it was shut down, it shut down for a variety of different reasons. But what's notable about this facility is that its initial construction operation was supported by the government. It was led by, government support for building this facility. And so since that time, for decades after the shutdown of that facility, the West Valley reprocessing facility, commercial used nuclear fuel recycling wasn't pursued for a variety of reasons. And I'd say it's mostly, when I talk to people today about why we haven't been doing this for decades, it's mostly, economics, as well as proliferation concerns associated with separating a pure uranium and pure plutonium stream. But I'd also say U.S. policy on recycling played a role, right? So there was the Carter policy in 1977. Of course, President Reagan reversed it in the 80s. There was also a shift in policy in the early 2000s with the Bush administration. So it's been kind of fluctuating, and I think that's part of it as well. But another example, when I talk about the economic side of this, is the cost estimates associated with constructing traditional large-scale recycling facilities to recycle the uranium and plutonium using the technologies I mentioned earlier. That cost estimate ranged into billions of dollars. And so that, coupled with cheap uranium prices at the time, made these facilities economically non-viable. It's why try to recycle to use nuclear fuel when you have cheap uranium that you can just buy, from the ground and process into fuel. And so, with that being said, why do I think recycling will work today? Like, basically, what has changed since the decades in which we have not been doing recycling? So, largely, like simply put, I'd say today the market conditions as well as the nuclear landscape have changed and make this an ideal opportunity to pursue recycling. So, firstly, there's a rising demand for natural uranium ore. right? Several countries around the world are building nuclear reactors. There's a lot of fervor around nuclear, the promise of nuclear as a clean source of electricity. And so, along those lines, like China is leading the way in the world with at least 35 reactors under construction today. So that means uranium demand is naturally going to increase substantially. In addition, a lot of the advanced reactors.
35 is crazy. I'm sorry. I'm just like, I mean, you sort of read things like that, but it's kind of eye-popping. But anyway, please continue.
It is, and it's actually bigger than it was before. I think a few years ago it was like 25, and they're like, "No, we're gonna do even more."
I
And so
want 35.
35. They already have 60 reactors
Right.
right now, like 58 to 60 reactors that are like operating right now, and they want to construct 35 more, right? And remember, I said earlier that we have 94 operating reactors, so they're on their way to catching up with the U.S. and being the largest like producer of nuclear power in the world. So you just think about the fact that you've got 35 reactors alone in China under construction, and other countries are also pursuing new nuclear as well as nuclear newcomers in other countries. And so what this means is that the uranium demand is going to increase substantially. And you know what happens with demand? As demand goes up, prices will go up too, or supply goes down too. And so prices will go up. And so, in addition to that, right, many of the advanced reactors that we're so excited about today are going to require high assay low enriched uranium. So, in order to make this high assay low enriched uranium, also referred to as HALEU,
That's uranium that's enriched to a higher level, up to like 20% or something, rather than I think 3 to
right,
5% for a
right,
commercial
exactly.
reactor. Yeah.
And thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, so the current reactors today, including several of the ones that China's building, they're what we call light water reactors or thermal reactors that use uranium that has a uranium-235 content that has been enriched to 3 to 5%. And so now we're talking about going from 3 to 5% to up to 20%. And so that takes a lot of uranium, right? It's going to take a lot more uranium than what we're currently using. And so you
Well,
have that
4 to 6 times as much, I guess, right? Or
around like
yeah,
maybe up to
yeah,
3 to 4. Yeah, it's
4. All right. Well,
yeah, something
yeah,
like that.
right.
Yeah, so it's actually quite a bit. And so I haven't looked at the calcs in a while, but I seem to remember 3 to 4%. And so or sorry, 3 to 4 times. That's gonna take more natural uranium. We're also talking about, so microreactors, which are a type of advanced reactor, they're gonna require high assay low enriched uranium, also referred to as HALEU. And so that's gonna increase the demand more. And so bringing us back to the nuclear fuel, the used nuclear fuel is around 96% uranium that is actually slightly higher enriched in natural uranium ore. And we're sitting on 96,000 metric tons of it, right? And so in my mind, that's a strategic resource, but we're throwing it away, right? And then, of course, speaking of HALEU, along the HALEU is part of this as well. We, the US, don't have sufficient HALEU production capabilities to support our advanced reactor needs. Now, don't get me wrong, the government is doing a lot. They have been doing a lot over the last few years to help stand up a domestic supply chain. But one thing that has kind of created a hiccup is the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022, because, prior to that point, Haley was largely being sourced from Russia. Like that's the only source of large scale HALEU that we can source in the world. And so recycling companies that are intending to recover uranium and other actinides from this existing used nuclear fuel assert that this mixed actinide material can serve as a backstop for HALEU while the U.S. grows this capability. And then, of course, advanced reactors. That the other part about this that makes the environment different is the fact that we have advanced fast reactors that are capable of more effectively consuming actinides, more a variety of actinides, right? And use nuclear fuel that improve the economic value of the fuel. And so even when you start talking about recycling HALEU fuel, depending on the residual enrichment, that can actually also be cheaper than HALEU, which makes a stronger case for recycling. Recycling companies are also interested in strategically recovering other material from used nuclear fuel. So the primary objective is to recover the actinides from the fuel and use it to make new fuel for more effective, more efficient burning in fast reactors. But there's also interest now on a broad scale and strategically recovering other material from used nuclear fuel. And this creates multiple additional value streams, right? This we're talking about things like critical minerals, isotopes for, medical applications, space exploration, things like that, which further strengthens the business case for pursuing recycling in the US. And so I'm really excited about this possibility because when you start talking about recovering not just actinides, but also these other valuable materials from used nuclear fuel, you're also reducing the toxicity and the amount of any remaining waste that would need to be disposed of in a repository. And then lastly, how are things different? It's important to note that these technologies that we're talking about are expected to be simpler, right? We're not going to have so many different processes that are involved and equipment involved. And so we think it's going to be more cost effective and also more state of the art or more scalable than the state of the art technology. Just to answer the question about what the government's role could be in us doing this, I just want to reiterate that, other countries, their approach, they have state-owned recycling facilities. So these are countries like France, Japan, Russia. They have their own like state-owned recycling facilities. Now, in contrast, our model relies on private sector execution with government support. So that's a marked difference between how other countries are doing this. And so I believe the government's role is to enable and de-risk deployment through strategic policy and funding. After all, this is what actually worked in the past. And the two main occasions on which we have embarked on recycling, each case the government provided support financially and as a policy. And so the other part of this that needs to happen is that it's a regulatory change that needs to happen. So the regulatory framework that was historically used for recycling back in the 60s to license the West Valley facility, that framework has evolved to support reactors. And so modernization of the recycling framework, regulatory framework by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission could help streamline and accelerate the licensing and deployment of advanced nuclear recycling facilities, just like the current efforts by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to develop an advanced reactor framework are intended to do the same thing for advanced reactors.
The last question here, and this is kind of like everybody's big question whenever you say the word nuclear, right? Is it safe? And I think in this context, there are kind of two components to that. One is, sort of in a traditional environmental sense, somebody needs to go build a facility somewhere and they have to like take used nuclear fuel from somewhere else to that place. Or you mentioned co-location, maybe it's at the same site where there's already a power generation facility. But one way or another, you got to like build this thing. You have to run it for a period of time. You have to decommission it. People who live nearby, want to be kind of reassured that that's safe. Then, we've already talked, or you've talked, fairly extensively about the non-proliferation angle, but that's certainly another dimension of it. Is that safe? Is this somehow going to lead to, theft or diversion of nuclear material, or in some way encourage somebody else to have more nuclear weapons than they otherwise might want to have or might be able to have? What's the answer there?
Good question. And this is, yeah, when I talk about recycling, like I said earlier, the two things that come up are economics and non-proliferation, right? And so I guess the question, a lot of times the question is, should Americans be worried about this? And I'd say Americans actually should not be worried, but rather informed about recycling. And so especially the modern technologies that we're talking about today, right? So these technologies, as I mentioned before, they're not like the traditional legacy processes that allow or that produce a pure plutonium stream. So we're trying to co-recover those together. And so the other thing is that the recycling technology that we're using that are co-recovering this material, especially technologies like pyroprocessing, they're done under really they're done in a hot cell environments in which there's a high radiation field. And so there's some self-protection associated with that because it's too dangerous to even try to, come in and divert. I'd say also the recycling technologies we have today, we're basically leveraging decades millions, arguably billions of dollars that our own Department of Energy has invested in advanced safeguards and monitoring and material accountability to allow us to have even more robust monitoring to, detect diversion even earlier than we have right now. I would also point to history, right? So I think you mentioned earlier La Hague in France. La Hague is the world's largest recycling facility and in the world. And they have very robust safeguards in place there to make sure that the plutonium that they're generating is not stolen. And as far as I know, there's no evidence that any plutonium has been diverted, and there's weapons abounding all over the place. Like they've kept it under very tight wraps. And so as I said before, material or techniques like pyroprocessing are also, because you're co-recovering the plutonium with uranium and other actinides, this product is actually less suitable for weapons than outputs from, older approaches, especially, historically during the Cold War when we were talking about or when they were trying to recover weapons grade plutonium. There's not weapons grade plutonium in our facilities. This reactor grade is less attractive. If we compare the plutonium, if you compare the case where you're taking the used nuclear fuel and you're storing it for a very long time. Now the plutoniums, if you're concerned about plutonium, it's a very long-term concern because it's still there, right? But in this case, at least you are destroying that plutonium inventory, then you're getting energy out of it at the same time, in particular clean energy, right? And so I guess the last things I'll say here are that in addition to destroying plutonium, reducing that proliferation concern, these recycling techniques can allow us to significantly reduce the volume of waste that's requiring long-term repository disposal. It also reduces the toxicity of the waste. And so this means that you can do a better job of managing the footprint of that facility. And this improves long-term environmental outcomes. And so using these advanced safeguards technologies we have supports a controlled and engineered approach to waste management instead of doing long-term accumulation. And so right now, the countries that are engaging in recycling include, France, which is, our ally, and then there's also Russia. They have the leadership in this space, especially Russia. They're working with other countries to set up, long-term, decades-long agreements in which recycling is part of that solution. And it just seems that we are ceding some of our leadership to entities that are not our allies. And so if we, the US, take strong leadership in this space and begin, continue to recycle in a responsible, safe, and secure manner, this could raise our non-proliferation standards and not weaken them, and allow us to kind of regain that leadership in the nuclear space.
Thank you very much, Christina. I think that was a really great kind of explanation and overview of kind of the key issues around recycling nuclear fuel. I can tell how excited you are about it. I'm sure our listeners can too, as I'm sure everyone listening can tell. I certainly think it's something well worth the U.S. kind of leaning into and exploring. China, I don't think is really doing it now, but they're clearly positioning themselves to do it. And I think that's something else that we very much have to keep in mind. Again, for our listeners, this is Paul Saunders with the Three Questions podcast. And this was a really fantastic conversation with Dr. Christina Leggett, who's the Director of Fuel Cycle Technology at Oklo and a nuclear engineer. So thank you so much, Christina, for being with us today.
Thank you, Paul. This was very fun. I'm really happy I had a chance to come in and talk to you about that.
Thank you. Thank you.